58 years ago, shortly before midnight on April 16, 1961, a group of about 1,500 trained exiles, Cuban-trained exiles, trained by the CIA, launched a doomed invasion of Cuba and the Bay of Pigs, an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro and his communist government. Why did this operation so hopelessly fail? Well, because everyone involved fell victim to groupthink. Groupthink is a phenomenon defined by Irving Janis in his 1983 book, Victims of Groupthink. Janis says, it's a mode of thinking people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive group, when the members, striving for unanimity, override their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. The group here was the Kennedy administration, who took over the plan without question from the Eisenhower administration before them. Many of Kennedy's military advisors said an attack by barely armed exiles was bound to fail. Kennedy went ahead with the attack anyway. This is where a concept called constructive conflict would have helped. This is where, instead of acting only to minimize conflict, members of the group seek to speak up and express differences while still promoting the group's common goal. For example, Arthur Schlesinger, an assistant of Kennedy's, was the first to know and object to the Cuba operation, which would later become the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. Schlesinger said in his 1965 book, 1,000 Days, "At one stroke, you would dissipate all the extraordinary goodwill which has been rising toward the new administration through the world. It would fix a malevolent image of the new administration in the minds of millions." But during cabinet meetings, he and others shrank in their chairs, reluctant to say anything, afraid to interrupt a seemingly unanimous administration. Discussion of these objectives, however, would have avoided the conflict altogether. The problem here can be referred to as false consensus. The Working in Groups textbook by Engelbert and Wynne says the issue occurs when members of groups given to pressure or an external authority and accept a decision they might not otherwise support. In Janis's same book, he mentions some structural faults that happen when a group is guilty of groupthink. One fault is lack of impartial power. He says, at each meeting, instead of opening up the agenda to permit a full airing of the opposing considerations, Kennedy allowed the CIA representatives to dominate the entire discussion. The president permitted them to refute immediately each tentative doubt that one of the other members might express, instead of asking whether that anyone else might have the same doubt. Additionally, I would argue that in this situation, Kennedy was an example of an autocratic leader, although he was expected to be a democratic leader. A 1999 journal by Pat Weiskill says autocratic leadership involves the use of commands and expected compliance. This worked for him because he had a very charming and motivational persona. For example, he landed a man on the moon with this persona. But in this situation, it led to disaster. The goal was to eliminate Castro and his brutal displays of power. Instead, as soon as the trained exiles landed, failure was clear. The expected support from locals that they counted on was not found. Assumptions that Castro's army was weak were untrue, and the Cuban exiles were all killed or captured and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, and also resulted in many remaining issues. Now that I've given an overview of the event, possible sorts of conflict involved in the event, defined false consensus, and talked about the types of power that were at hand, on to Brandon with gains and losses.